Discovering my autistic self has been a long and involved process throughout most of my life. It was frequently tossed around as a possible diagnosis. However, it wasn't until my late 20s that it was officially added to my label list. Part of this was due to my high-functioning Asperger's. I just seemed far too intelligent to have autism as it was understood at the time. And there were so many other things to blame my problems on. There was also just a general lack of awareness of Asperger's. For instance, when I was in elementary school, my mother was told by a school psychologist that I might have Asperger's. However, the amount of information about it was 2 little paragraphs long in the DSM-V. So, in short, the field acknowledged that Asperger's existed, but it had no idea what to do with it. So, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is sort of hindsight awareness. Events and ideas are categorized as best as I can on what I know now. I hope it provides some use to those currently living or caring to those with autism or Asperger's. One of the things that people on the autism spectrum are known for is sensory issues. These issues can arise from any of the 5 basic senses, and perhaps more that aren't necessarily readily recognized. For some, lights are too bright. For others, sound is too loud. Their skin will drive them crazy, or they can't stand to be in the room full of people because they can feel the energy from so many others. A common idea behind this is that people with autism have a poor capacity for handling various sensory inputs. And I'm personally not really qualified to give an accounting on all the theories that are out there, but I can try to explain my personal sensory issues and what they felt and continue to feel like to me to some degree. To start, I need to explain a concept. There's 2 sides of awareness. First, there is the awareness that something has happened. So if someone pokes you, you know it has happened because you know you were poked. This is a general awareness that almost everyone shares. It's a simple awareness that you have awareness, that you exist. Now, the other part is a little bit more difficult. It's realizing that your awareness might not be functioning the way it should be. For instance, people who get drunk but don't know that they are. For people on the outside, when you poke a child and they have this extreme reaction, similar to being jabbed with something burning and there's a lot of bleeding involved, to the obvious observer, there's something wrong. That's such an extreme reaction. They're not bleeding, they're not burned, but here's this horrible blood-curdling screech. However, that might not necessarily be obvious to the child. No matter how many times you tell them it's abnormal, to them, what they're feeling is their normal reaction, because they have nothing to compare it to. Take colorblind people, for instance. Recently, there's been a development of glasses for people with certain types of color blindness. It allows them to see various colors they were missing out on. So you can see some of these videos on YouTube where people are suddenly able to see all these colors, and it's really touching to see these people and realize what they're missing. They knew they were colorblind. They had been told they were colorblind, but until they could recognize what color blindness was for themselves, they didn't see as much of an issue. Whereas someone, who wasn't colorblind, if they put on glasses that caused color blindness, they would see how the world looked in comparison. Sensory issues, no matter how bad they are normal for the people until they can come to the awareness of how they could be different. Until a contrast is provided, their focus will always be on changing their environment to suit themselves instead of changing themselves to adapt to their environment. It's something to think about when you're wondering why the autistic child is reacting to his or her environment in such strange ways, instead of internally dealing with it or working through it the way a normal person would. Most people aren't aware of all the sensory information that comes in just from the skin. This is because skin just isn't skin for most people. Skin is covered in hair. Most people see hair on any area of the body, for the most part, as sort of a fashion statement. How much of what hair goes where and what looks best for me. What's forgotten is that each and every single hair on the body is attached to its own little sensor. Reach out and grab a single hair somewhere on your body and give it a sharp tug if you need a reminder. For me, growing up, hair was something of an enemy. When I was a child, I wasn't really aware of this dislike for hair. I had not developed that level of contrasting awareness. I really didn't like shirts that came with tags or other certain types of fabric, but I really didn't have any trouble with my overall body surface. Then came puberty. Hair growth typically gets put into some minor category compared to all the others when it comes to puberty. However, for me, it just sucked. Instead of this nice, fine layer of lightly colored, fluffy fuzz hair, I suddenly had all these bigger, grosser, tougher hairs that grew out all over the place. And each one was tied to a sensor that tickled and itched and brought a constant awareness to almost every area of my body, and was really, really distracting. So, out came the shaving razors and off came all the hair. Growing up, I would shave my body about once every couple of weeks, just because I couldn't stand that tickle itch anymore. Of course, there were some fairly serious social drawbacks to this at the time. All it took was just one: Dan shaves his leg, he must be a girl or still thinks he's a child, he's just weird, to basically ensure that I had social issues with locker rooms for decades. And not knowing about autism at the time, I came up with all sorts of wild psychological reasons for my behavior. But it always came back to my first impression. This doesn't feel good, it's very distracting. Now, naturally I'm lucky that I could stand the touch of a razor to my bare skin. Too many others are far too sensitive for anything like that, short of it being some kind of torture session. But I want people to realize why some autistic people suddenly take to covering themselves. One example would be those arm wraps that people wear sometimes. Socially, it's unsightly. But for someone with sensory issues, it's a relief, because it stops the hair from tickling. It stops the skin from sending signals. To help people understand what I'm talking about, here's an exercise you can try with someone to get a general idea of what it's like for someone with sensory issues. Have them hold up your arm and assume you have hair on your arm. Close your eyes and focus on your arm. Then, at random, have that other person gently blow across the hair on your arm. You know that tickle feeling that you're getting? Now imagine having to ignore that sensation all over your body, everywhere, anywhere, all the time. One of the best ways to get that sensation to stop is to cover the hair and skin tightly with something, so there's no chance whatsoever of the environment again, from ever again interacting with you in that way. For me, I just personally found it easier to simply remove the hair than flatten it out. Another way to provide awareness of just how profound the contrast of sensitivity is for your entire body, for those who can't make that connection, let your hair grow out all over your body, your arms, your legs, your chest, for at least a month, and then go swimming. And just move around in the water, keeping a general feel of how your body feels in the water. Then go shave yourself from the neck down. And within 24 hours later, go back to the pool and notice the difference. I know when I swim after shaving, I feel like I am swimming in nothing almost. Like the water really isn't there. That's the contrasted difference. That's how much input is really coming into you from your hair alone. Even without hair, the skin itself is also a major source of input. Although most people don't realize it until they're old and frail, when your skin gets thinner, it loses that fatty insulation. If you want to see an autistic reaction to skin sensitivity, with someone who doesn't have autism, go take a single drop of hot or cold water and drop it onto the skin of some elderly person with thinning skin. The shock reaction, I feel, is almost the same. Now, someone with autism may have a lot of physical insulation. However, they don't have a lot of mental insulation. Every drop is a shock because the person is fully aware of the full sensory input. There's no buffer. So, this explains, at least in my opinion, why an autistic person doesn't want to walk through the rain. They feel every drop. They don't want to go through the bushes. They feel every scratch. Any unusual tactile sensation that crosses the skin, you feel it. You feel it all. And it just consumes so much resources having to deal with that. For me, this applied to many other things outdoors. From the wind blowing across my body to insects that could land anywhere. While you can indicate to other human beings that you're not in the mood to be touched right now, Mother Nature doesn't really care or notice. So, of course, the solution was just another pick your poison, which was to cover your skin with all this sticky bug repellent residue, which you couldn't rub off. The sunlight was equally annoying. Having your skin bombarded with this glowing heat that eventually caused burning, not fun. The alternative? More sticky residue. Sand seems like fun, until you realize you can never get rid of it all. All in all, the great outdoors always seemed to be more trouble than it was worth. But I had to go anyway, because it was good for me. Hearing, sight, smell issues, I'm not really certain if I had any of those autistic issues with any of those senses. If I do, then they were mostly overwhelmed by how they interacted with my attention deficit disorder and my obsessive compulsive disorder. Suffice it to say, I was always noticing, and always thinking about what I was noticing. While the 5 basic senses are what are generally categorized as the full sum of human physical capacity for sense, I would like to add one other that isn't officially recognized, and that is the sense of presence. One of the things I've learned over the years is the body and heart is this one big mass of electrochemical energy, and it can be sensitive to the changes around it. The heart can pick up the rhythm of another person's heartbeat at about 18 feet. The brain, as it is encased in bone, can pick up another person's heartbeat at about 1.5 feet. And the brain can pick up the electrical activity of another brain at about 1.5 inches. So, what does this mean? What this means is that each person is generating their own beat, their own rhythm. Everyone within 18 feet of a particular person can sense it. Now imagine walking into a room where every single person is beating on a drum at a slightly different rhythm. It's not loud pounding, but each one is its own steady beat. And an autistic person doesn't have any insulation against this. Now, they're getting all these different beats, and they have to manage their own. So now try to pick up a drum and keep a beat of your own while having to listen to everybody else's. It becomes incredibly difficult as there's all this competition all around you. Holding your own beat is very important for someone with autism because so much of life is centered on keeping themselves centered. Control is the name of the game. So, when I go into a room full of crowded people, it quickly becomes very draining, as I have to devote larger and larger amounts of resources and energy into ensuring that my own rhythm of control is stable and ignoring everybody else's. Now, I can last for a while, but putting distance, sitting off in the corner by myself, that helps a lot. One of the hallmarks of autism is a failure to recognize social cues and behaviors and learn them the way someone normally would, by simple interaction and observation. Social interaction for me growing up wasn't something that was impossible to learn, but it doesn't come naturally either. I feel part of this comes from a rather primal look at the purpose of social interaction. One theory of groups states that people engage in social groups when there's a benefit for them to do so. Now, I know it's callous of me to say this, but for my mind, that's my default way of looking at social interactions. What's in it for me? The issue with the answer to that question is there typically isn't a tangible, concrete response that will satisfy it. Will being polite and tactful and sensitive and cheerful net me any tangible benefit? Well, a parent teaching a child to behave, the answer to that question might be yes. However, the main reward for proper social interaction is more social interaction. People who like to talk to you more. People who get along with you want to spend more time with you. People who care about you are more friendly, which results in having to engage with more friendly social interaction. In general, unless you're trying to get a job or land a date, there just doesn't seem to be any reason to devote that much energy into mastering this seemingly useless cyclic behavior, at least not in ways that are readily apparent. So, the emotional reaction someone with autism experiences when someone tells them to learn proper social behavior is similar to as if someone had simply told someone else that they're going to have to learn this complicated advanced math or chemistry in school for their degree, and then tells them on the first day, well, you're never really going to need this, it's just part of your degree. Like an advanced chemistry class. Social interactions are this long, complicated list of formulas that you not only have to be memorized, but you also have to understand as well. You have to understand them so that when the situation changes, you can change the formula in response. The thing is, only the most devoted would ever willingly subject to themselves to that kind of forced education if they thought they could get by without it. I can't count the number of people who go to college who have wanted to know why they needed such and such a class for their major, and it just doesn't have anything to do with their chosen field. There are people with autism out there that can be very social, and they do it very well, but not without a lot of hard work. Even after mastering it, they still have to devote resources to picking up that skill set every single day and engaging it when they need it. What people need to realize is that for an autistic, learning social interaction typically isn't fun. It's something that has to be practiced with the same devotion you would expect from someone who plays the piano, and riddled with almost as much failure. The sad thing is The only real practice you get with social interaction is actually doing it. So your failure isn't private, it's very, very public. With people who will undoubtedly get upset with you, take offense, and stay that way for reasons you might not yet understand. This is where a person first gets the feeling like they're perpetually on a different planet, or at least in a foreign culture. I lived in Barcelona, Spain for 2 years as a teenager when my family moved there. While the school held classes in English, the students spoke English. It was difficult for me to learn anything beyond the basic Spanish I needed to get by. Like, where's the bathroom? Or I need help, or I want this, or yes and no. This wasn't because Spanish was hard, actually. I still retained a lot of what I did. It's just I settled for good enough. My default for learning the social skills is somewhat similar. I know enough to get by. What's the big deal with having to learn more? Now let's say someone with autism has learned proper social skills. There's a big difference between being able to take a social test on paper and passing with flying colors because they've immersed themselves into it so well, they can repeat the social book back to you verbatim and actually having that information there when you want it or need it. To give an example of this, I would have to describe my brother. My brother also has autism. He could be considered functioning. However, his issues are more severe than mine. He actually falls more into the autism spectrum and less into the Asperger spectrum. My brother has the hardest time remembering certain critical aspects of tasks. For instance, don't clog the toilet, don't leave the stove on, don't put too much detergent into the washing machine, take your medication. Now when you mention these tasks to him to remind him, he declares, I know. And I believe he does know, on paper. But when it comes to engaging that information, when it's needed, it doesn't cross his mind. For me, social skills are sometimes like that. I know what the proper response is. It's just accessing that information right then at the right time. It just doesn't happen that way. It takes effort to always be aware of what I should and shouldn't say at all times. It's very draining, and it always causes these lags in conversations and interactions that just make the social situation even all that much more awkward as I try to make sure that I've actually got the right response when the right response was supposed to happen, and by that time the right response is already passed and it's too late. For the emotional aspect of dealing with a world of social issues, there are entirely different problems. There is this feeling that doubt that comes from repeated failure. Now, some autistic people I have met just seem to be able to shrug it all off. Each social failure is insignificant and they just keep plugging away. I tend to mentally flog myself over each one. I emotionally feel each injury, which damages my self-esteem, which triggers my depression, which reduces me to an unfunctional state if it gets bad enough. In any event, a layer of doubt is added each time you go out and engage in social situations. Even today, after many social conversations, I walk away from each one, most of the time, and wonder, did I communicate well? Were my comments appropriate for the situation? Even if I even think I have offended someone, I feel apologetic and wonder if the situation would have been normal for someone else and not for me. Or was my autism a contributing factor? Or was it just typical for everybody? What's the variables here? Sometimes I feel I spend way too much of my time telling people I have autism as an excuse for not getting a joke or understanding a social meeting or not catching something I think or they think I should have, or even preparing someone else for what will come out of my mouth because it might be negative or something else. Needless to say, this makes trying to be on your best behavior very stressful. Tact is especially hard because it seems to violate the very essence of what open, honest communication should be. Remember that social communication, when you have autism, isn't fun and games. It's work. And if a person is going to take the time to learn to communicate with someone, they should at least be able to do it without having to hang on all the little half-truths that might have to one day be addressed later. Frustratingly, conversations typically start out with tact or courtesy lies. For instance, the phrase, "How are you?" Most of the time, when people ask this, they are really just trying to be polite, or so I've been told. And they really don't care how you are doing, they're just being polite. However, for the autistic, they are stuck in a mental quagmire each and every single time someone asks this question. If it is an honest question, then it deserves an honest response because they're actually showing care and concern about you. And thus, the question deserves a truthful response, which means you have to come up with an answer after thinking about how you really are doing. And if it's not a genuine question, and it's just a customary greeting, then the person doesn't actually care. And if they don't care, then why should you waste your time talking to them? And if you have to talk to them, then they just started out a conversation by asking something they didn't want in the first place, which leads you to doubt the sincerity of everything else. Of course, you could train yourself like everybody else to just give an automatic response of, "Fine, how are you?" But that's neither genuine nor is it necessarily accurate. And then you have to start to question your own integrity for the conversation and your standing with that person. Now, I'll admit, I don't have an exacting use of language whenever I talk to someone. Sometimes I am just lazy with my own word choices. Other times it's, "You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means." However, my underlying intent is always to be truthful. I want to assume it is everyone else's underlying intent to be truthful as well. But when the whole system has exceptions for truth written in everywhere, it drives you pretty crazy. Let's touch on non-verbal social cues out there. Non-verbal social cues, first off, are individual specific, it seems. There are some generalities, but everybody's just a little bit different based on the environment they grew up in. What applies to one person might not necessarily apply to another. So, while you can read all the books in the world about nonverbal social interaction, and I've read quite a few, when you get out into the world, the margin of error is just so much bigger. This leads to one of the most embarrassing social blunders as you constantly apply meaning to every gesture, glance, and bodily posture that person makes. Make the wrong assessment, do something inappropriate, and you could ask them about it, but there's no guarantee you'd get an honest answer. And even if you did get an honest answer, the person might be offended that you asked. The upside to this, of course, is that since non-verbal communication is individual specific, that once you learn a particular individual, you're actually much better at communicating with them. Since using nonverbal communication is somewhat more truthful. You have a hard time conveying false or misleading information. There's also the fact that nonverbal communication comprises a whole lot more of the communication interaction. While I support the growing social freedoms that people gain in the world, the social freedoms in the world also, to a certain degree, directly contribute to my autistic confusion. You used to be able to make certain judgment calls about a person's manner, style of dress, body language, jewelry. There were books written about them. Now, all that information is almost useless. For instance, third finger, left hand. There. If there is a ring on the third finger of the left hand, that typically meant a person was married or engaged. Now, that's no longer sure. Sometimes, I envy cultures where you can read people based on certain rules, the same way you would read a dating profile. Certain colors, certain patterns, certain ways of dress, mannerisms, whether or not they're doing this or that, how close they're standing next to each other. It's all spelled out in the cultural handbook. And you can still make accurate judgments about this stuff. In America, you just can't do that anymore. Growing up, I always felt another social issue with interacting with my peers was the constant state of competition that seemed to be a part of almost everything. This is not the type of competitiveness where I felt I could do something better than someone else and took pride in it. It's more of a one-up system that didn't quite fit into my mentality. For example, I got tall relatively fast. I'm 6'4", and naturally I got pressure to do basketball. So I tried it out at church for a season. I didn't like it for two reasons. Both had to do with this competitive nature. First, there's the rules. Rules, or laws, are there to be respected and obeyed for everybody's safety and the game's structure, or at least so I thought. But apparently, for everyone else, the rules were there to be broken when you could get away with it. You were expected to do everything you possibly could to score. And if that meant getting just enough rule violations that you didn't get thrown out but still got enough scores in, then you were doing a good job, and to heck with whether or not you followed the rules. Then there was the competitiveness with each other. And while I did understand that to a certain degree, there was just so much of it, all the time, in everything. So constantly, all around me, there was competitiveness within the system itself and with each other. Competitiveness all over the place with just getting attention or achievement. In hindsight, I've always wondered if it was just because I was always in competition within myself, that I couldn't be bothered to deal with external competition with everybody else. So where does someone go with autism where they don't have to feel this constant pressure? Well, there are those too young to be the person's peers, and then there are those that are too old to be anything other than simply purely friendly competition, which explained why some autistic people tend to get along better with people who are younger than them. Those that are younger with them automatically see the older, physically autistic person as at the top of the food chain. So there's no point to the competitiveness. And with older people, much older people, like adults or grandmas or grandpas, they left that scene a long time ago. And they don't even consider the person younger than them within their peer group. All of this leads to what I feel is the biggest issue with being on the autistic spectrum: loneliness. I know that loneliness isn't something that's exclusive to autism. But a lot of issues with autism feed directly into making sure someone with autism feels even more isolated. This isolation then tends to feed into the idea that we really don't belong in this world. That we feel, and this makes us feel even more isolated. Now, one of these forms of loneliness is social isolation. Now, social isolation isn't as bad as it used to be. With the creation of the internet, it's much easier now to find someone else out there, some other human person, not just a pet creature person, that you can interact with, who shares your interests, your likes, who won't make judgments because they haven't met you in person. So this isn't as bad as it used to be, but I still, to a certain degree, feel it's a poor substitute for actually interacting the way humans interacted with each other for thousands of years. The other type of social interaction, however, is relationships, particularly intimate ones. Now, I know that even in the general population at large, intimate relationships of all sorts are happening all the time. Some are successful, some not so much. The vast sum of written, sung, and spoken things out there that deal with relationships clearly shows that there are tough things to work on in even the best circumstances. However, nature clearly shows us that we're supposed to have these relationships, and they're supposed to work. Otherwise, we as a species would have died out by now. Now, I could probably talk for a long time about this topic, but I'm going to try to be concise here and why I feel as an autistic I have problems forming intimate relationships. Social issues that I have already discussed aside, there are two primary reasons I think that are real critical factors as to why it is so hard to engage in proper social relationships. Confidence and expectations. The quick and dirty of this would simply be that I don't have any confidence to fulfill any satisfactory expectations. I don't expect perfection of myself, but I do expect I should be able to give a relationship what I would expect in return. The trouble is, I have a seriously hard time justifying anything I have to give as being equal in a relationship. First, there's the general societal expectation that an adult male in society should be able to fulfill, namely the capacity to generate steady income. One of the first questions that comes up in most conversations when you meet someone new is, what do you do for work? Hi, I live on disability and housing assistance with an income that's barely half of minimum wage, and that's just not a good answer. Neither is many of the other minimum wage public service jobs. Then there's the question of, where do you live? Well, I live with my family, or I live in a group home, or on housing assistance. Those aren't really good choices either. Someone would say that this is an opportune time to exercise tact. But if you're in a relationship or want to form one with someone, it's important that you don't lie. And starting out by being cryptic with the truth is too close to lying for my comfort. Now, assuming you can avoid all of that, and you're lucky enough to have developed a marketable skill that produces a good, steady income and can show physical evidence of it, or skillfully answer questions that don't make you look bad, there's still your personal baggage. And it's a lot. Anyone who gets into a relationship with you will have to face that fact. The trouble is, at least in my mind, I can barely stand myself when I'm dysfunctional. Why should anyone else have to suffer with it? Why would anyone else want to? I don't want to. I wouldn't want to date or have a relationship with someone like me. So trying to comprehend why someone else would rationally want to is very hard. I know, biology can get people to do some pretty amazing, crazy things out there that don't make any sense. But I don't want to feel like anyone else was driven into a relationship because of biology alone. Growing up, I was nearly impossible to punish or discipline. I've often wondered myself if I was simply beyond being able to be disciplined. Oh, I got scared with threats of physical violence done to my person, spankings, that kind of stuff. But anything short of that was typically a waste of time. I even held a perverse sense of pride at the fact that I had been grounded for nearly 4 years, all of my high school, from my beloved video games, which did cause my attention deficit disorder to suffer, but did nothing in curbing my other issues. I feel the reason most punishments had no effect was due to my ability to retreat within inside myself. Highly imaginative, I feel even today, I can take something very small and insignificant and blow a huge story out of it if I need to. Timeouts, grounding, restricted activities were all just opportunities for me to go inside myself, shut off the world. What was punishing about being restricted to any of these things was just simply a fact that I was restricted from acquiring more source material when I couldn't play video games or watch TV. While I could make up my own fantasy world, it was always easier to hijack somebody else's. To end, I want to mention a little bit about dependence. Autism is one of those disabilities where, depending on how severe it is, you may or may not be able to live on your own. In my past, I was fired from almost every job I had, partly as a result of my autism. For nearly the last 18 years, I have been living alone on Social Security disability, and while I haven't had to work in all that time, I have always felt that there was something wrong about that. My brother, who also has autism, although it's much more severe, does work, albeit with a lot of effort from a job coach. However, he is unable to live on his own because he is unable to successfully maintain proper care and safety by himself. In both cases, this is a subtle injury to ourselves due to our dependence on others beyond what is expected for someone our age. I want to be able to justify my life as being equal to anyone else's. My brother just simply wants to be independent. Time and again, however, we're both shown that this might not ever happen. It's unacceptable for an employer to have to deal with someone else's meltdown. And setting your own apartment on fire or flooding it doesn't look great on the rental agreement. To face this reality hurts. To know that you're different. And no matter how hard you try, there are some things about yourself that are always going to hold you back. You can't read these things in our faces. It's not apparent just by looking at us or just having a conversation with us. But it's real. Just as real as if we were physically crippled in some way that was apparent.